Hi, Mako.
Hey, Julia. Tell us how you're doing. You're in Pasadena, so you've been on my mind of late.
Yeah.
How is it there right now?
I live in a place that is dramatically changed by fire.
Mm,
The community we're still dealing with it, right? Because the fire isn't over.
no.
2 weeks ago tonight is when the Eaton fire started. The Palisades fire had already begun.
Mm,
But the Eaton fire is specifically what's impacting my locale of
mhm,
LA.
mhm,
Um, and that massive change has come to the area because
mhm,
so many people are displaced as a result.
mhm,
Fortunately, I am not.
mhm,
Um, I did leave for some days to avoid the worst of the smoke
mhm,
inhalation, and
mhm.
I know many others were able to do the same and then came home. Um, but many are not able to go home, and I even know people that are still not able to go home, and then there are people who um, don't have a place to go back to. They have ashes. Um, and every block you drive closer to the fire is that much more denuded of color.
Mm,
That many more branches are down.
mm,
It's you're driving into a whiteout
mhm,
of ash and smoke. Um,
mm.
and the winds came through the whole region. I know somebody that lives 20 miles away and their roof blew off.
Oh my.
And it wasn't an old roof, it wasn't a roof in need of repair. It was just
Yeah.
the winds are that strong.
Yeah.
The Santa Anas are a force of nature.
Mm,
And it's a hurricane without rain, you know?
mhm,
Um, and one of the beautiful things is the way the community has come together.
mhm,
When people's GoFundMe's are met, they're directing
mhm.
their communities to people that are at GoFundMe's with less than 20%.
Yeah.
Um, the
Wow.
donation centers were so overwhelmed. They're like, we cannot take anymore.
Mm, yeah. Yeah.
The community has really shown up.
Yeah.
The first people that were offering masks were Mass Block LA, that
Mhm,
because they had been working on air quality for the past 5 years and they had the resources and they were like, here, you need these even more now. Here are masks, here are air filters.
yeah.
Um,
Mm,
and like I think about companies like Sway, Suay. You can donate to them and they will divert the excess donations from landfills because there's
mhm,
this other
mm,
economy that's happened in
mm,
terms of all the donation, right? And they're like,
mm.
we can have this be a generative process
Yeah.
long term.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course,
Oh,
World
yeah.
Central Kitchen is here and
Yeah.
feeding all
Mm-hmm.
the displaced, all the first
Mm,
responders.
mm,
And then the Center for Cultural Innovation.
mm.
In a week, 10 days, they had $12 million
Oh my.
for artist grants.
Wow.
They're
Wow.
in partnership with the Getty, et cetera. And the applications are now open. So all the artists that lost their studios, that lost their workspaces, that lost their homes,
Mm,
they can now apply for for money to
mm,
rebuild.
mm,
And so it's just been amazing to see the diversity and creativity
mm-hmm.
of approaches
Yeah.
and long-term solutions and the way the community really has shown up for each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People are reorganizing their living situation so that they can have more people come and stay with them.
Mm, mm.
And that's a really special thing. And I don't think that just happens everywhere naturally.
No.
I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes
Mm-hmm.
people are like, well, this is what I have, and I'm going to hold on to
Mm-hmm.
this, and
Right.
this is mine.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
the attitude here is very much this is for all of us, and how are
Mm-hmm.
we going to get through this as a community together?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's so beautiful to witness, to be a part of that in
Yeah.
whatever way I can, and to hear again and again. Everybody that I talk to knows somebody that lost their home, their material possessions.
Mm-hmm.
One person, they were out walking their dog when the evacuation order came in. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't even get to leave in their car,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And you hear story after story.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that person is being taken care of. They have a place to go. And it's just, that's the ongoing narrative right now.
Yeah.
But we're only 2 weeks in. And so
Right.
the hope is that this can continue, that
Mm-hmm.
this can we can learn from this collectively
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
have we have a system in place and hopefully it will continue to work well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
in terms of fire management and safety, what are we learning? Like
Yeah.
we can see
Mm-hmm.
now the places that didn't burn and what they were doing differently.
I see.
And so as things get rebuilt,
Mm-hmm.
using that knowledge,
Yes.
and will that be prioritized and how will that be
Mm-hmm.
prioritized?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I'm hopeful because the information is there on how to build fire resistant architecture
Mm-hmm.
and fire resistant landscaping.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
so we'll see what can happen long term as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Well, like as you noted, it seems like there are different reactions in every disaster like this, and I'm glad to hear that your community is coming together, which is what I saw after 9/11. It was probably the most communal time that downtown Manhattan ever was, and I kind of treasure that now. Looking back, I got to know my neighbors and their dogs and their children, and we had time to talk, um, actually have sit down and have a deeply meaningful conversation with strangers, because they've been through it as you have, and it's not the same, with um, each disaster is different, and so I'm so glad to hear that, Julia. Mm, mm,
Yeah. And it's very serious and it's very extreme and it's still ongoing. Like the fires still aren't contained. They're still a threat.
yeah,
And until it rains, it's an elevated threat. And
yeah,
so living with that feeling, that unsettled,
yes,
and being like, okay, this is my reality,
hmm,
and I continue in the midst of this.
yes, yes, and it's one thing to survive that, to get through it, but after like 3 months, right, your adrenaline runs out, and um, everybody kind of goes through kind of this depressive cycle. And I remember um, having a studio space to create and having people around me who are also makers and artists. It it accentuated that uh, idea of not just communal getting together, but encouraging each other to create, something out of the reality that you're going through.
Yeah. And there have been multiple art auctions already,
Mm.
you know, and people are continuing to produce and to offer.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's a great thing too.
Tell me how it's affected how you view your own art, or has it?
I I've been wrestling with the question of arts and advocacy
Mm.
and what is the intersection and what is the role of the artist in being faithful to what the work wants to be
Yeah.
and what you feel you should be saying.
Mm, mm, mm.
And frequently they overlap,
Hmm.
but sometimes they're divergent.
Yeah.
And um, navigating that. And I'm also in a time where I had decided back in like, I think November, I decided that I wasn't going to be posting on social media during
Right.
January
Right.
at
Right.
all.
Yeah.
And so that has been a whole nother level of like, but I should be saying something about this. And I said, you don't have to be on social media to say that thing right now.
No.
You can have, you can say it in February or in March or whenever you go back to it.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and you can be doing work in quiet.
Hmm.
Um,
And
and
that's really
I'm
important.
always doing work in quiet, but it was, sorry, go
No,
ahead.
no, that's really important. What you just said is to give yourself permission to not produce. It's kind of intuitive. It's like of course, you want to make something, going through that, and yet what you're saying is beholding um, the reality in front of you that you see, that you know this burnt out Altadena, that it's just heartbreaking and it takes time. I wonder if our creative process works a little differently. What you said about what the work is telling us, the voice that is coming out of our work, and what we have projected ahead of time, for that work to be. And um, I remember um, not being able to think about any kind of purposeful, um, let's say like a commission where somebody commissions you and you want to execute it, and there are certain parameters, and I remember struggling with that, like notion that I have a direct, straight direction from, and the only way to be honest is like you're saying, pausing for a while from being productive. It's almost not possible to be in an industrial production mode,
Yeah. And that being said, I did start a new series at the start
Mm,
of the year,
yeah.
and I've been working on that. And I did a prayers for rain painting,
Yeah.
uh, that I didn't
Mm,
post anyway. I posted on my blog, but I didn't post on social media.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's good.
and so like I am still picking up the brush. I worked on two large paintings this morning before our conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
doing the things, but in in quiet, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
In a different way than I
Yeah.
have been for the past 4 years of sharing, 5 days a week what I'm painting.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe all of us can join you in that, just whether we announce it or not. It could be done in secret too, but praying for rain sounds like a good theme. You know?
yeah, yeah. And at the end of, I just wrote a couple sentences and I said, "Will you join me in praying for rain?"
Mhm. Mhm.
Because that is what the scientists are saying we need to change the air quality, to change
Yeah.
the danger that all of this burning poses.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so it's just so important that it would rain and that the humidity levels would remain higher.
Yeah. 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 And this season is usually a wet season for you.
This time last year, I
Yeah.
was literally painting with rainwater. I would set a sheet of paper
Yeah.
outside
Yeah.
in the
Wow.
rain.
Wow.
It would dampen the whole sheet,
Wow.
and then I would bring it in to
Yeah.
paint the rivulets.
Yeah.
And it was this whole, it was called an
I remember
atmospheric
that.
river.
Yeah. 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 That's
And
right.
it truly, I have not ever experienced rain like it any place else I've lived.
Wow.
It was immense. It was torrential. You
Mm.
were in the water.
Mhm.
Like it was amazing. I didn't have language for it. I mean, the
Yeah.
meteorologist gave us atmospheric river, but the
Right.
experience of it was so profound. So
Oh,
this time last year, literally, I was painting with the rainwater.
hmm hmm hmm
And yeah, it's inadvisable to paint with the ash, so I will not be doing that. But um yeah,
Right. Right. Oh, so much, destruction and so much pain, uh,
yes,
all over the world.
yes,
And artists are always intuiting that, I think, whether we are conscious of that or not, especially if we slow down enough
yes,
to listen and feel deeply about it's in the air. And, I, to me, art has always been prayer.
yes,
That has been a way that I would describe my art is, um, this is what I do to pray, and so that it there's a disjointedness between that and commerce of art.
yes,
You know what I mean? Like especially in such a time as this, we tend to always try to connect those, in the marketplace, in the galleries, and Instagram is it's a huge marketplace. But I always felt like, at least my art didn't belong in that just transactional realm. There's nothing wrong with that. We all can participate in that in some way, but at the end of the day, the essence of what we do seems to come from a different place.
yes. Yeah.
Mm.
And I mean, it ties in with the Simone Weil, absolutely focused
Hmm.
attention is prayer,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
that's also loops into that arts and advocacy split that I've been
Hmm.
navigating, right? Of
Hmm.
like, this is what it's saying and this is what I want it to be saying, but this is where the attention lies.
Mm. So, what is that attention for you when you're paying attention? Does it surprise you in any way?
I think when I'm focused on the painting itself, I'm so engaged with the details of the material interaction and how that's playing out on the paper, in the pigment, with the salt, with the water, that I'm not, I mean, I have my heart and my mind and whatever they might be processing about the current situation, locally, nationally, globally.
Mhm.
But in that moment, I'm really focused on the material.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
frequently it translates to what I'm thinking and feeling
Hmm.
show up in that. But
Hmm.
sometimes they don't, or sometimes it's at
Hmm.
odds
Hmm.
with what I would want it to say about my take on a situation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's where I'm trying to figure that part out.
Yeah. So it's like a, you know, um, conversation, but it's somewhat one way, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
the material is like insisting on its own thing, and um, I can see how that would translate into a visual medium because you're dealing with literally the atmosphere, right? And
Yes.
and and this explosiveness of what's happening, the dry air, um, causing this, hurricane like wind, and the damage that can cause, let alone the fire, the wind part, and yet, um, the materials are aware in some way, of what's happening. So we're paying attention to that, um, and I think in some ways, um, I find myself as I listen to what is happening to the surface of my paintings, um, I find myself both finding healing from all that is happening, the necessity of survival, and all that's happening in the world, and um, thinking about the pragmatics to my responsibility to that,
Yes.
weight of that. Um, and I can just see what the paintings tell me, as I am praying, that and it's a really interesting process of discovery.
Yeah. Can you speak more about your feeling of responsibility as it pertains to the making?
Yeah. So Jaques Maritain had a book called Artist Responsibility, I think it's called. And it's a surprising title, right? I mean, you don't connect those two themes, responsibility and art, um, very often. And he's a philosopher, and he was writing in Paris at the time, coming out of the existentialist Sorbonne, and he became Aquinas scholar. So he was translating basically Thomist philosophy to contemporary language, and he had friends, artist friends like George Rouault, and he was um, interacting with them about nature, beauty, and suffering, and I think he contextualized responsibility to the integrity of an artist, um, painting, integrity in terms of material, but also in terms of his or her time in that place and that moment. And it's profound because what was happening in Paris, right? Ex, uh, you know, um, the threat of Hitler Germany and marching, and the academia exiting from the notion that divine providence is a work, and so you find yourself very alone, and if you're an artist of any kind at the time, whether you had Catholic faith like George Rouault or not, or struggling, faith-wise like Picasso, it doesn't really matter because you're in the same place, of, if you want to say, call it responsibility. You're all called into this integrity of being an artist in wartime, or being an artist in time of totalitarian oppression, and when we think about that, we kind of like say to ourselves, well, maybe we need to revisit the artist responsibility book in some way, because I think that's uh, kind of where we are, with all that is happening. And what is the artist's responsibility in and the brokenness of injustice, of um, and environmental crisis? What is our responsibility to fellow human beings, going through suffering or being exiled from certain tribal, boundaries? And so all these questions, uh, perhaps today more pronounced, and I mean, it may be an opportunity for us to reconsider that question.
Yeah. And even as you talked, like everybody, every artist that you mentioned approached it differently.
Right. Very differently.
It's like all of us have our own creative response to the
Mhm.
responsibility
Yeah.
of the artist.
And that's in some way what you want to see happen, right? Is people have different approaches, different materials, different ways of addressing it. But Rod talked about Augustine writing soliloquies, and this is an interesting term because Augustine thought he was writing this soliloquy, all alone, proclaiming what he believes and into the world. And then he finds out that throughout history there were others who also sang their soliloquy, And so thought, well, I'm gonna paint and write my soliloquy, but I want to call it soliloquies because um, I am, I have so much to share, so much in common, and learn from the past that way. And so maybe that's part of the responsibility is to recover a sense of history and finding out these roots, both in terms of our personal journey and history and our ancestry, but also sourcing kind of this way of finding out where the materials have come from, and why is that important, and and tracing the roots of painting and process, and then thinking through on, well, certainly art is part of the market system, and how do I then execute whatever it is that I'm trying to do in the marketplace, um, but do that faithfully, without losing that integrity in the process, not being so consumed by the outcome, but staying true to myself. All these things are very prominent in in thinking of artists of that time and many other periods of history where we have these huge cataclysmic shifts in culture, epochal shifts, and then it seems like the artists are the ones that actually come to integrate something in those moments, and bring in this new language that will become culture at some point. But so Maritain, I think, is kind of projecting that in this little book is that's how I respond to it. Is there's something about this responsibility, that is not boxed in to what the society requires or what my expectations are, but that it's actually projecting something into the future and saying, creating some new ways of looking at ourselves and trying to, do our best, and by really articulating that in our soliloquies, we tend to find comrades, along the way, and people that we can learn from.
Yeah. We're a lot less alone and a lot less singular in our experience than we think,
Isn't
right?
that amazing?
And the great thing is, the more we become aware of that, the more we find
Mhm.
sojourners, you
And
know?
singularity too, right? The
Yeah.
individuality comes from being in a community of different,
Yes.
people. And that's what's paradoxical about it, is that if we can't hold that tension,
Yeah.
um, we never discover that about ourselves. So we end up living in fear that we will
Mm,
lose ourselves in some way. But
mm,
the beauty of diversity is that, artists are good at this. We have all sorts of people on stage, right? And uh, jazz cannot happen without literally musicians who play differently on stage.
yeah.
And comedy is all about these, you know, minute things that are creating schisms, right? And so you look at any art form, we see this fantastic diversity and mosaic of just differences and even like competitions, vigorousness. But we tend to, when we are especially stressed and we are in a survival mode, we tend to try to reduce that into more, force binaries, and we try to create, we versus them, and this is, scapegoat the problem, and artists, we tend to be creatures that can simultaneously hold paradoxical elements, juggle them. And so I think part of it is discovering ourselves in the context of community and sojourners and history, and then by losing ourselves, we find ourselves.
Mm. Yeah. And because artists are so frequently scapegoated,
Right.
they already understand the nuance of the paradox.
That's a good point. That's a really good point because, yes, unless you have been a recipient of being exiled, you don't really understand, right? When you are doing it yourself, it takes enormous courage to recognize it in yourself. And now artists can become very bitter and hardened by being scapegoated. But extraordinary artists tend to stay resilient and almost nimble to these ways of being stereotyped, and we have the capacity, at least, right, to help each other to hold on to our humanity deeply, um, and that's what I see it as the most important thing that artists can teach others, to the world, to the and I'm talking about not just in the context of friendships and on neighboring, but in terms of leadership, in terms of even you know politics, even that we have to learn to expand our imaginations, um, and crisis will force us to reckon with that, because we can be very hardened by it,
Mhm.
and embittered and solitary and protective of ourselves, or it's an opportunity, right, um, to jump into this chaotic reality that we know we can't control. And somehow I find that if we can do that as artists, and if we can do that well, first of all in our studios and on our stages, but really in life, like if we can do that well in the context of a community, we end up blessing others
Mhm.
whose natural tendency is not to think this way, right?
Mhm.
Is to get back into tribal
Mhm.
foxholes,
Mhm.
and that may be one of the greatest needs right now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we will pray for rain.
We will pray for rain as we exist in diversity
Amen. And you know, I
and
think this
community.
and community and we'll maybe I am culture care can help in that in some way. So think and pray about that.
I will.
Okay, great to
Good to
see
talk, Mako.
you.
Take
Okay,
care.
okay, bye bye.
Bye.